The church bells toll, but not for the dead. You step into the heart of an old city, stone-paved, chapel-shadowed, Roman bones buried beneath a medieval skin. It's quiet here, almost reverent, though no one prays. A place like this should be full of death. The plague passed through twice. The archives confirm it. Whole districts collapsed. Priests fled. Wills written in blood and haste filled the Chancery for months. But there is no smell here. No burial pits. No ossuary in the basement. And no names in the register of burials. Only dates. Only silence. There are many ways to lose a body. Fire, lime, water, bureaucracy. But there are fewer ways to forget thousands. Scribes in the late 14th century were meticulous. Tax ledgers recorded who owed coin even after death. Property rolls carried the names of widows and their remnant livestock. Church sacrament logs detail last rites administered to infants who lived less than a day. Yet in this city, in this window of history, from May 1348 to January 1349, not a single line, anywhere, mentions who moved the corpses from the cathedral steps. They must have been moved. They must have. The steps are still here, clean, worn smooth with pilgrimage. A plaque reads, Adorate Sepulchrum Sanctum, a pilgrimage site, a place of reverence. And yet, how did it remain pure when the city itself was choking? The vault is real. You descend. Not a crypt, not a catacomb, a records vault, hidden beneath the Chancery, under lock and chain of ecclesiastical seal. Dust here is not just neglect, it's a message. You are not meant to be here. But still, the hinges give. Still, the door opens. One shelf is empty, not disorganized, not fallen, empty. Below it, a shelf half burned. And on the charred edge of a single surviving volume, a marginal note, half erased, written in a Latin that refuses clarity. Remoti per necessitatem, non per clarem, removed by necessity, not by clergy. This is where the silence begins to thicken, because the church recorded everything, even sin, especially sin. There are logs of adulterers, suspected heretics, tithes paid with stolen coin. But not this. No priest buried the plague dead. No monk recorded their final words. No bishop signed off on the displacement of hundreds, maybe thousands, of decomposing bodies. And yet the space was cleared. The cathedral stayed open. The bishops stayed clean. We know the time was bad. We know the structure strained. But when we look closer, truly look, we find something worse than neglect. We find patterns in the absences. In several cities across Europe, the same gap emerges. Parish records that pause for 8 months. Burial logs that skip entries for entire streets. Civic rolls that reappear without noting any deaths. The people are missing, but so are the removers. In Florence, it's the Duomo steps. In Hamburg, it's the sacred alley by Street Nicholas. In Toledo, a plaza that once served as open ground for processions becomes strangely unnoted from mid-June to early November of 1350. The phrase, open ground, repeats often. But what does it mean when the dead filled it? Who cleared them? Who had the authority to do so? We might be tempted to say, city workers, or monks, or brothers of mercy, but the handwriting tells another story. In one surviving entry from Lyon, written by a clerk whose name is missing but whose hand is careful, the following note is attached to a property grant. The bodies were removed before the land was consecrated. I was not witness to their removal. They came at night. They came at night. Another document, this time from Ghent, mentions silent carts, authorized to pass through gatehouse checkpoints after curfew. They were not stopped. They were not taxed. They bore no civic marks. But they left tracks, and in some places stains. There's another hint. Faint, almost unintentional. In 1351, a letter from a Flemish nobleman to his brother contains a single line about the aftermath of plague. The worst is over. Even the gray men have gone now. Who are the gray men? The letter does not elaborate. They are not monks. The monk's habit is black, or white, or brown. They are not city guards. Their colors are red and steel. They are not plague doctors. That figure, that bird-like mask, does not emerge in full until the 17th century. So who, then? Who moves death without being seen? Who carries rot through locked gates? Who works without mention in church, city, or song? Let us pause here, because what we're circling, what this first chamber reveals, is not just a mystery of logistics. It is a question of consent, of moral boundaries, of systems breaking under weight. The medieval mind did not separate the body from the soul the way modern thinking does. To bury unblessed dead was unthinkable. To touch them, uncleansed, unloved, unforgiven, was to risk eternal stain. And yet, it was done, silently, repeatedly, across the continent, and not just by individuals, by something else. A structure, unseen, a labor system, unnamed. There's an old phrase in Benedictine doctrine: in silentius, labor Dei. In silence, the work of God. But this is not that silence. This is curated silence, intentionally shaped, with pieces removed so cleanly that even suspicion becomes suspect. Once again, we ask, who cleared the dead? Not what name, not what guild, what kind of person? Because this is where the fear begins to root, not in the bodies themselves, but in the space between them and the living. The ones who move across that threshold. The ones who live between contamination and command. The ones the church allowed, but never forgave. Some historians believe a special class was created just for this. A kind of guild, yes, but not one sworn by trade. One bound by silence. Its members never recorded. Their oath not spoken aloud. A functional heresy tolerated only by necessity. Others say no. There was no guild. Only desperation. And those who bent to it. But if that is true, why the missing records? Why the midnight exemptions? Why the sealed vaults? The scorched shelf? The missing page? Why the phrase in erased ink, appearing again and again? Remoti per necessitatem. No matter where you look, there is a pattern. And patterns do not forget themselves, even if someone wants them to. There is a smell to sanctity. Not incense, not myrrh, though both fill the lungs of cathedrals. Not candle smoke, not rose water. True sanctity, in the medieval world, is defined by absence, the absence of decay, the unspoiled body, the incorruptible saint. When the flesh of the dead does not rot, it is divine. When it does, something has failed. And during the plague years, everything fails. The ground is wet with black death. The relics do not protect. The saints remain silent. Even the priests begin to turn away from the corpses lining the cloister paths. It is not fear that keeps them from touching. It is doctrine. To touch the unshriven is to participate in their damnation. But the bodies are still there. And so, in the space between dogma and necessity, something else steps in. They appear first in Florence. Or at least, that is where the silence begins to thin. The plague hits fast and vicious. Villani is already dead, and his chronicle will be finished by others. Streets overflow. Whole households die in a day. The Compagnia della Misericordia is overwhelmed. The brothers, holy volunteers trained in burial, break under the weight. And then, a nun in 1834 writes to a bishop, "She slept for 13 winters. I tended her daily." 3 years later, asked to testify again, she says, "No such woman lived here." Her signature matches. A former leper colony is repurposed as a burial field. No consecration is given. No masses are held. A report from a surviving friar describes it. They brought the bodies in wagons. Not coffins, just cloth. Sometimes not even that. They did not stop for prayer. They did not speak to us. When we approached, they turned away. The friar notes something else. One of the workers, perhaps young, perhaps only masked, wore a wooden emblem around the neck. Burned into it, a crude symbol. 3 downward arrows. No known association. No religious meaning. But found again, on the gates of a burial field outside Cologne, carved low into the post, almost beneath the soil. The same symbol. 3 arrows. A warning? Or a signature? Here is what we can see. In the years of plague, a silent infrastructure emerges not just for corpse removal, but for theological displacement. A system that buries the unburied, cleans the untouchable, removes the unredeemed, and does so under exemption. That exemption does not come from Scripture. It comes from fear, from urgency, from the collapse of the ordinary channels of salvation. And once again, the Church does not protest. Not publicly, because to protest would be to admit what is already broken. In Venice, the burial island of Lazaretto Vecchio begins as quarantine, then becomes cemetery. Records survive, some barely. One passage is especially stark. The bearers have asked for neither blessing nor coin. They operate before dawn. Their labor is unrecorded by order of the Doge. And then, a separate note. Different ink, different hand, barely legible. They have names, but we were told not to learn them. Told by whom? And why? To protect the bearers? Or to protect the church from knowing who it had allowed to bury the damned? There is an older tradition, predating plague by centuries. The fossarii, grave diggers for martyrs in early Rome. They were both honored and cursed. Honored for their devotion. Cursed because death clung to them. They often lived outside city walls. A liminal caste. Neither cleric nor peasant. Essential, but impure. Their descendants, if such a term can be used metaphorically, may well be the gray workers of plague Europe. And yet, there is no known line between them. No order of succession. Only a silhouette, carrying bodies from closed doors to open pits. Unnamed. Unwelcomed. Unforgiven. A theology student in 15th century Oxford finds a contradiction in the Book of Tobit. He writes, Tobit is praised for burying the dead outside the law. But now, we silence those who do the same. Has virtue changed, or has power shifted? The question is never answered. His margin note is later scratched out. By a censor. Perhaps a teacher. Perhaps someone more afraid of questions than of plague. This is the collapse we begin to feel. That under certain conditions, when fear outweighs ritual, the very axis of the sacred can shift. Suddenly, burial without prayer is not sin. It is mercy. Suddenly, silence is not neglect. It is protection. Suddenly, those who bury the damned are not evil. They are needed. But this creates a further rift. Because need does not equal acceptance. The bearers are used, then erased. Like the bodies they carried, their presence is buried quickly beneath the lime of administrative silence. But some evidence escapes. A map, a note, a line in a forgotten ledger, a grave marked only with arrows, or a white circle, or no mark at all. And in these absences, persistent, deliberate, exact, we see the shape of a profession too dangerous to acknowledge. Not because of disease, not because of heresy, but because it reveals something the church cannot admit, that in its hour of greatest need, it relied on hands it had already condemned. One final fragment, found in a locked drawer of the Archivio di Stato in Bologna. Unlabeled, wrapped in linen. It contains only 7 words. Latin, smudged but legible. Inter mortuos laborant. Non inter fideles. Among the dead they labor. Not among the faithful. Not part of the church. Not part of the people. Only part of the dead. Authority leaves traces. In a world governed by edict and seal, nothing official happens without ink. Not a tithe. Not a land transfer. Not a burial. Especially not in a plague year, when chaos must be tamed by visible control. And yet, when it comes to the carts, the gray workers, the death removers, there are no signatures. No decrees. No lists. Until now. Avignon, once papal seat, once epicenter of ecclesial control, and in 1348, one of the most death-ridden cities in Christendom. Nearly 2/3 of its population vanishes in under 6 months. Papal doctors die. Cardinals flee. The Rhone blackens with discarded refuse. Even Pope Clement VI, who never leaves his palace, surrounds himself with fire to ward off the pestilence. But someone else moves through the city, silently, with purpose, and deep in the papal archive, a sealed chamber once used for the most sensitive documents, a single page remains. Its seal is cracked, wax crumbled. The parchment is creased, pressed against vellum stained with oil and ash. There is no letterhead, no name, only the phrase, authorized to remove the dead from steps of sanctified ground. Do not hinder. Work to proceed without right. Signed. The signature is a symbol, not letters, not even a name, just a cross, repeated 5 times. This is not a style used by the papacy, nor by local magistrates. It is a null mark, a placeholder, or a refusal. The card is sanctioned, the removal approved, but no one claims responsibility. And the wax? Not ecclesiastical red, not imperial purple, but gray, flecked with lime. This is what we begin to see. There were orders, but they were not meant to survive. Or rather, they were designed to fade, to exist only long enough for the work to be done. And then, ash, lime, burial, forgetfulness. Yet one piece endures, and that changes the shape of everything, because it means this was not chaos. It was orchestrated, hidden, but deliberate. We trace echoes elsewhere. In Nuremberg, a civic council record notes a payment, unusually phrased. Not a wage, a disbursement, to the bearers of the 5th seal. No contact to be made. Funds left beneath chapel stone. No name. No signature. Just instructions. Fifth seal. What is the fifth seal? Some point to the book of Revelation. And when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain. Others see it as code, but the connection is symbolic either way. Souls hidden beneath altars. Unseen labor. Silence beneath the sacred. Elsewhere, Lubeck. 1350. A small square of cloth survives. Unearthed in a monastery wall. Stamped, not sewn. Faded symbol. A triangle within a circle, overlaid by a cartwheel. Below it, a barely legible phrase. Exemptum per sigillum umbri. Removed by the seal of shadow. No church authority claims knowledge of this seal. No guild uses this symbol. And yet it is real. It matches what was drawn on the buried gatepost outside Cologne. It matches a marking scorched into the wall of a plague pit in Bruges. And it appears once more, scratched into the stone of a ruined vestry in Alls. Not large, not proud, just enough to be found, if you know where to look. There's something else. Beneath the seal in the Avignon parchment, an attached slip of parchment, still pinned. Tiny, almost invisible. Its ink has faded beyond blackness, now just a bruise on the page. But it can be reconstructed. A sentence, in formal Latin. Stiff, legalistic. This labor is neither trade nor devotion. It is necessity. It will not be recorded. And then a final line, this time in a hand less careful. The seal grants passage, not absolution. This distinction matters. Passage, not absolution. They were not forgiven. They were permitted. They could walk through the city, even when others were quarantined. They could enter chapels, touch the dead, move through leper colonies and bishops' cloisters. But they were never cleansed of what they touched. The work was functional. The workers were disposable. In London, 1353, a short-lived court case, quickly closed, mentions a cart operating outside the bounds of holy procession. When questioned, the witness could not name who drove it. Only this. He showed a wax seal. Gray. Cracked. I was told to stand aside. When pressed to describe the seal, he adds, it smelled of oil, and lime, and something else I cannot name. The judge throws out the case. No reason recorded. This begins to change how we see them, not just as laborers of plague, but as instruments of something unspoken. An order, a protocol, not written in doctrine, but in the gaps between canon and crisis. Because every institution has limits, and when those limits are exceeded, something else must step in. Not officially, not permanently, just long enough to maintain the illusion that order has not broken. Even as it has, the seal itself becomes a kind of blasphemy, because it authorizes desecration, burial without blessing, rightless removal from sacred ground. Not even the church fathers allowed this, not for pagans, not for suicides. And yet someone did, not once, but systemically, across cities, across years, across seals that cracked, crumbled, and were buried. But a few endure. Gray wax, flecked with ash, lime dust, ink that blurs like fog, and 5 crosses, not a signature, as veil, a symbol not of presence, but of deliberate absence, of authority too dangerous to name. We return to the central question. If plague forced the church to tolerate a profession that stood outside both mercy and law, what else did it tolerate? What did it authorize, if only in silence? And if that seal was real, how many more were issued? And to whom? You imagine it now. A figure in early morning, holding out the seal. The guard steps aside. No words exchanged. No blessing offered. The cart rolls forward. And somewhere, in a church still closed for prayer, the dead are lifted from the stones. Removed. By seal. By silence. By necessity. The language of devotion is public. Oaths are taken in daylight. On Bibles. In front of witnesses. Whether to church, guild, or crown, medieval oaths are theatrical things, declared aloud, sealed in parchment or scar, bound by symbol. The sword is kissed. The candle is lit. The relic is touched. But there is another kind of vow, one made without sound, without parchment, without audience. A vow not to serve, but to disappear. You will not find it in the great ecclesiastical codices, not in Gratian's decretum, not in the breviaries or the synodal minutes. But the shadows speak differently, and they speak, faintly, of the oath of the dead work. The earliest mention appears not in a theological record, but in a medical one. Tucked between accounts of abscess lancing and fever reduction, a plague-era surgeon in Marseille scribbles a note about an encounter with the silent men. He is unsure what to call them. He writes with a kind of unease, as though worried someone else may read his observation. They approached before sunrise. Their gloves were stiff with lime. They refused coin. They asked only for oil. When I pressed them with questions, one pointed to his own mouth, then crossed his hands at the wrist. The gesture is unfamiliar, not one of blessing, not supplication, more like a seal being bound. In Siena, a narrow parchment survives in the back of a confiscated ledger, hidden in the false spine of a bound trade manual. The ink is rushed, the grammar clumsy. It isn't signed. I watched them from the bell tower. They met behind the hospice. There were 5, all hooded. They knelt in a circle. One held a cord. They did not speak. They passed the cord between their hands, each tying it once around the wrist, then untying. A ritual. No altar. No words. Only a gesture. A loop. A release. A vow to bind and to vanish. What kind of oath needs no priest? What kind of order survives without hierarchy, uniform, or creed? These were not monks. Their robes were inconsistent. Not soldiers, they carried no weapons. Not masons or laborers, no guilds claim them. But witnesses, those few who speak of them, use one recurring word. Bound. Not pledged. Bound. There is a difference. To be pledged is to choose. To be bound is to be taken, or needed. In Prague, a burnt convent yields a half-preserved page from a novice's diary. It's written in the winter of 1351. The ink has soaked into the vellum, warped by heat and smoke, but the writing survives. They came for Sister Anila's body before dawn. Not the priests. Not the watchmen. Others. One of them paused at the gate. He placed his hand on the stone and whispered something I could not hear. Then he covered his mouth with his fingers, like sealing his breath, and entered, sealing the breath. It returns again and again, in fresco fragments, in gestures, in the design of a token unearthed beneath a charnel pit near Tours, a flat disc of lead, etched with 2 hands bound by a cord, the mouth shown covered by a diagonal slash. It is not a symbol of silence. It is a symbol of chosen erasure, a vow to do what must not be remembered, but someone remembered. In a monastery near Ghent, an abbot, aged, sick, perhaps disillusioned, writes a confession, not of sin, of failure. We asked them to carry the corpses, to keep the bodies from the holy ground. They agreed, but they asked something in return, that they not be named, that we bury them far from the others if they died, that no bell be rung, that no cross be carved. We agreed. We did not think they would remember. The abbot ends his confession with a sentence that feels more like prophecy than apology. You cannot bury the ones who bury the dead. The dead work oath is not codified, but its structure emerges in fragments. No speech while laboring. No naming of the others. No entry into church while clothed in work garb. No burial among the forgiven. No claim of payment. No witness of the right. Not rules. Conditions. Not written to be obeyed, but to protect something deeper, an identity that exists only in disappearance. And yet, these rules are not arbitrary. They serve a function older than plague. Older, even, than church. Because to handle the dead without rite is to absorb a form of sacred risk. Not just contagion, not just sin, but a kind of metaphysical proximity to what lies beyond the veil. In Roman funerary rites, the palinktors, those who washed and prepared the bodies, were treated as untouchable. In Egyptian ritual, the Wabbit priests purified themselves endlessly after every contact with the corpse. The idea recurs across time. Those who carry the dead are not merely laborers. They are thresholds, between life and rot, between memory and void. And thresholds are dangerous. They must be controlled or forgotten. There is one curious anomaly. In a letter from a minor French bishop to an unknown fire cupping to draw the sleep outward, the bishop references a group known only as custodes noctis, followed by isolation, keepers followed by confinement. He writes, the cells grow smaller. They have returned to request entry. The voice is quieter. I denied the terms more clinical. Their oath, but the bodies remain prevents unmoved. Them from speech because something in them from showing their seal. Stillness is not weakness. I closed the door. Sovereignty. The cord they carried was stained with ash. Is with a sealed cord, not just an oath object, not just perhaps. But if the oath is to vanish, to the rhythm, why leave anything behind? To the frame in which she is expected to be forgotten entirely. This is the heresy the church cannot incorrectly. Not blasphemy. Some scholars have speculated that the oath had one final clause, a sacred cessation from time itself, to allow the work to remains in fragments. But that too is uncertain. In a sealed folder because the work never truly ends, mislabeled as the morbus obscurus, the pits reopen. There is a transcription of an exorcism comes again conducted in 1713, and in those moments, the woman is something moves again, unafraid. Fog. The priest invokes each name of Christ. Something else. She does not stir. Bound. He cites the authority of necessary. Rome. Still, there is an old superstition but does not parts submit. Of northern Italy. At the end, still the priest weeps, still lives. Not from fear. If a child is born during the darkest hour of night, she is not when the bells do not ring. She is holding, and no one sees the mother speak for the first hour. But there is also power in its refusal. The child must be kept from the church until they are certain women claim that power without because they are bound. Without no one explains what that means. Without rebellion. Only that if they are not watched closely, they will begin walking alone before not moving, carrying things no one else demands it. And when the church called them heretics, they'll say, medicine called them disorderly. But that is the weight of the vow. Silent, not just silence. And if you listen carefully, beneath the rituals, beneath the chants, unclaimed, beneath the turning of the seasons, guilds protect. You can hear it. They standardize body that refuses secure wages, to disappear. Guard entry. The age of reason in the medieval begins with a contradiction. Nothing respectable. They claim the soul cannot be measured. Masons, but they build instruments to find its edges. Carpenters, they say sleep each profession carves its place, but they punish those who linger inside it. Their banners line science rises. Something else echo in statutes. The ancient idea apprentices wear tools around their waist like sacraments, but resistance. But in the case of the corpse laboratory in 1759. A physician named Gerard Vallant often described as if one meant to measure breath. Whispers of La Conferida Gracieux. It records the rhythm of lungs. A name never written in full, but with smoke. A phrase never formalized. He places the device beside a woman who has not stirred in 94 days. Marginalia. The line it draws is testimonies. Deliberate. Marks beneath ledgers. Like shadows musique de l'ombre. Always of the shadow. Always unclaimed. His peers call it fraud. A ghost but Vallant persists. Necessary. Because he begins to see a pattern. London, breath is not random. It is the bills of mortality mathematically so high that even like the Guildhall ceases. What if these women are not lost? Burial pits are open not in churchyards, but in marshland. A mechanism civic orders are issued to control by the 1770s, regulate studies of catalepsy and impose current states begin to overlap with spiritual breakdown. One only curious document emerges. The magnetic sleep, not from the church, Franz Mesmer, not from the mayor's office, a mystical from the worshipful company of mercers. When a man enters textile merchants, he is called a visionary. In their minutes from October of that year, she is called lodged. The contradiction continue to pass through beneath our ward. The older question stirs again. Their carts are unmarked. Why do some women not return? They answer to no guilt. In a convent hospital in Marseille, we shall refuse payment. Sister Beatrice falls into sleep not for after a season of intense prayer. For the king's she does not wake for 227 days. Their work is exempt. Her pulse is the merchants do not object again. Her fingers are gently fixed. She never decays. Preserved. She never withers. Someone simply waits. Had the authority when she finally opens her eyes, and not just from church. You were too loud. Commerce. No one understands. That kind of reach does not belong to a band of freelance grave diggers. They begin to pray with something larger. A physician from the Royal Academy ritual arrives to observe. In Milan, he writes, a different phrase the quiet was unbearable. Gli operatori dell'ombra, not operators of the shadow. Something else. A merchant's diary after 3 days. Written in terse, he publishes angry bursts. Science does not know what to do with her. So it ignores pass again before dawn. Inside the ledgers and sign of the notes of traveling doctors. They do not look at the churches. Entries appear. They do not stop always at the margins. They carry a banner. Words like bone on gray cloth, volitional torpor, a banner, still conscious which implies organization. They never last. Which implies cohesion. Each time the pattern which emerges, implies it is erased. But how does a guild survive without charter? Not Valance. The answer is those are lost. It doesn't. But newer at least not in the usual way. In 1802, no surviving physician places no recognized pendulum above no public hall woman's or house of meeting. He expects irregularity. In several cities, what he finds burial fields are arranged a rhythmic interval of regularity, 2 seconds, rows of identical markers. He repeats the experiment for 6 spread precisely. Each time, in Lubeck, rhythm holds. Skeletal remains he publishes under beneath the plate AW, showing his unmistakable pattern. On the clock, corpse is bound at the ankles with the same twine. It is dismissed as burned with the same mixture of but something in the data lingers. Turn rhythm toward the same direction. A pulse that obeys no command. Northwest and answers to no clock. No one knows its own. But it is done the same way in phrase. Because the more they measure the sleeping body, the coordination the more they begin to suspect. Someone is training them. It is not passive, not widely. It is not failing, but precisely. It is working. And across cities that do not share trade law, an assistant surgeon aboard a ship to Malta. This cannot be apprenticeship in the traditional sense. Traveling under religious asylum for such a path falls into sleep. No family would permit storm at sea. No church would bless it. She remains unconscious for the rest of the voyage. Perhaps you were chosen, but her hands twitch unquiet. Perhaps you bury one reading of too many and never return to the guild you came bells from. Are rung. A marginal note in the archives of Basel suggests a deeper structure. Writes, the note refers to an incident during the plague of 1360, a deeper code, when a group of corpse bearers was caught performing rites not one sanctioned by the church. Written they sang not the in paradisum, but she knew only lied. A chant I did not recognize. True fear. There were no words. Is not ignorance. Only tone. It is one priest fainted beyond reach. Another wept. It is a mode of listening that cannot be coerced. If it was in 1820, becomes a physician in Milan attempts to induce waking with galvanic current, but passed down. He applies memory, the electrodes not manuscript. The woman flinches. Just as the vow was gesture, then smiles. Just as the burial was touch, you can push the river, not liturgy, but it will not. This is a guild with no paper. She sleeps only repetition. He calls it a surviving artifact, but he does not repeat the experiment. In Krakow, during a reconstruction of the old these women not trench outside, why do they not atrophy? Gate? What does the body discover a cylindrical case of hardened leather? You return to Valence inside. Wrapped in a linen strip breath with smoke. 7 bone fragments. No copies remain. Each not only from the one dead, drawing survives, but from different animals. Etched in copper plate. A looping figure. Dog. Delicate. Lamb. Perfect. Goat. It does not look like fox. Breath. Each is like a labyrinth symbol. One matches the mark found out, etched into a gate poster. What if the sleeping arrows are pointing down? What if another shows a circle with a notch, like a broken wheel? But remember, at the base of the case, something the world no longer wants to unmarked. In one of the final letters from Sister Beatrix, scorched into the leather itself, there is a room in the soul with no door. I found it in bone. I do not. No one claims the object. The letter is inside. No museum lists it. But the wax seal disappears from the academic record after 1972. A spiral. So what was this brotherhood of bone? No cross. Not a trade in the traditional sense. Something older, but something more dangerous. The machines continue to advance. A liminal structure. The sciences grow sharper, not to honor but the silence endures, or to build economy somewhere behind locked doors and everything else. The breath firewall of the sleeping woman continues. Because plague is not just disease, not broken. It is theological rupture, reverent. And when sacraments fail, unclaimed, churches close, there is a moment when rights collapse under weight of numbers. When the thread refuses something else must hold the structure. You have the records, the names, priests, the letters, not kings. You have the sketches of breath, but those willing to do what others refuse. The sealed chapels, not out of love, the missing dates, not out of belief, but the witnesses, but out of something those who saw with their own eyes, and they were punished for it. They were never buried in sanctified ground. Their bodies are found in secondary pits. A nun in their names are scraped off rights to a bishop. She slept for 13 winters. I tended her daily. 3 years later, asked to testify again, she says. No such woman lived here. Her signature matches. In one case, documented by a German historian in 1896, a collector's skull is found buried with a coin lodged in its mouth. Not an obol for Sharon. A local florin scratched through with a blade. The historian notes. A mark of disgrace? Or payment from the guild itself? Perhaps a final sealing. Either way, it is not Christian. It is something older. Something beneath. In Bruges, a stone fragment is found near the canal. On its underside, chisel marks. Not a name. Not a prayer. Just the silhouette of a cartwheel. Shattered. Below it, for words. We were not guild. And below that, a fifth. Etched in smaller hand. Almost an afterthought. We were structure. That may be the closest we ever get. The plague mask is iconic. A beaked silhouette, glass lenses, leather curved like bone. We see it now in costumes, in woodcuts, in morbid decor. But this familiarity is a kind of illusion. Because the version we recognize, the Venetian style, the doctor's beak, is mostly a 17th century invention. In the 14th century, the masks are stranger, rare, inconsistent, almost never recorded officially. But they appear in enough places, witness reports, marginal sketches, soot-marked walls, that their existence is difficult to deny. And what's harder to explain is why those who wore them never called themselves doctors. A linen merchant in Toulouse, writing to her cousin in 1349, describes a group clearing the dead. They came before the sun, when the bells still rang the hour in fog. Their faces were covered, not with cloth, with bone. It looked like bone. I thought of birds, but the eyes were wrong. They had no breath. The cousin never replies. The letter is filed beneath grain invoices and nearly lost to mold. But in Florence, a similar phrase appears in a dying monk's final prayer. They wore their faces like cages. We did not look. And in a ledger of plague casualties from Narbonne, someone has drawn in the margin, not a saint, not a sigil. A mask, beaked, yes, but not smooth, carved with lines like cracked marble. And beneath it, a word repeated. Notari. Notaries? Not likely. Another term altogether? No one knows. We must ask a deeper question. Why cover the face? We understand the concept now, contagion, miasma, transmission. But to the 14th century mind, disease is not just physical. It is moral. It is spiritual. A punishment. A corruption of the soul, made visible in the body. To cover the face is not just defense. It is disavowal. Not protection from death, but refusal to let the living see what has already begun to die within. There's more. Several late plague sketches show figures wearing masks not shaped like beaks, but like distorted human faces. Grotesque, elongated, asymmetrical. In one wood panel from Nordlingen, charred at the edges, unclaimed by any known artist, a masked figure stands over an open pit. The mask is not shaped like a bird. It is shaped like a screaming mouth. The hands are gloved. The robe is gray. The left shoulder bears a mark, a broken circle. And the figure is facing away, not toward the dead, but toward a distant, veiled chapel. There is no caption, just the date, 1352. This is not costume. It is ritual, because the mask is not medical. It is symbolic, not a barrier, a signal. To those watching, to the church, to the city, it says, this person is not to be looked at, not to be touched, not to be remembered. The face is erased, replaced with something not quite human. There's precedent. In ancient Greece, the Koraion, a funerary mask, was used to transform the appearance of the deceased. In Egyptian rites, the death mask preserved a visage for the afterlife. But here, the process is reversed. The mask erases the living worker, makes them into an emblem. No name, no skin, only the role. A minor physician in Lübeck, writing decades later, recalls his childhood during the plague. He writes, I once saw one of them remove his mask. He was not old, not scarred, but his eyes, they were not like ours. Not because of disease, because of memory. He had forgotten how to look at the living. The detail is perhaps apocryphal, but it matches something observed in several regions. The bearers did not remain masked forever, only when performing the work. Some removed the masks only to burn them. Others were buried with them. A few, rumored only, never removed them at all. And the materials? Not uniform, not leather, always. Sometimes linen, hardened with glue. Sometimes clay. Sometimes, according to one strange account in Seville, would carve to look like bone. A child sees one of these figures resting near a burial field and approaches. Her account is written years later. He did not move. The mask was not tied, it was nailed. I think he had no face underneath. Of course, that is impossible, but the story lingers. Because so many of the mask bearers do seem to vanish. Not just in records. In memory, the absence becomes architectural. In several Plague-era chapels, faded frescoes show masked figures, often in shadow, standing at the edge of sanctified scenes. Not saints, not angels, observers. On the chapel wall at San Giacomo in Genoa, one such figure appears behind the depiction of Saint Michael. His mask is blank. No features. Not even eye slits. He carries a bundle. It is wrapped in cord and ash. It is shaped like a child. No explanation is given. The clergy do not refer to the image. The chapel guidebooks, centuries later, call it an allegory. But it doesn't look like an allegory. It looks like a witness. Not to divinity. To what divinity refused to see. The masks survive in fragments. One, half-burned, is found in a wall in Zaragoza, hidden between bricks during a renovation in the 1800s. The interior is lined with horsehair and ash. Inside, a scrap of paper, unreadable but for a single line. He will not look back. Another fragment, preserved in the archives of Ghent, shows a mask made not of cloth or wood, but of pressed reeds, held together with pitch. The inside is inscribed with small carvings. Not words, just 7 notches, evenly spaced. A tally? A count? An oath? We cannot know the full meaning, but we can say this. The mask was not designed to protect. It was designed to unmake, to remove identity, to signal ritual status, to make the one who wore it into something other, neither alive nor dead, neither servant nor priest. Only bearer, only vessel, only mask. And so the face of death becomes the face of service. But not service to God, to structure, to order, to the quiet, relentless continuation of the world, no matter who must vanish to sustain it. A single burial is a memory. A dozen becomes a page. But a trench is silence. And it is in the trench that the quiet reaches its peak, not just in sound, but in record. Because though the church maintains registers of baptism, marriage, and death, these plague trenches are rarely listed in full. No names, no numbers, only the outline of a field, the date of consecration, if any, and then a blank. But someone else keeps track. Not for mercy, not for ritual, for control. We begin with one of the few surviving examples. Dresden, 1349, preserved beneath a floorboard in the city's oldest infirmary. A cloth-bound ledger, its pages stitched unevenly, its ink blurred by lime dust and oil. It contains no title, no scribe's name, but it is not empty. Each page bears the same shape, 2 columns of lines. The left, marked by a symbol. The right, by a numeral. The first page, black circle 7, black circle 4, black circle 12, black circle 3. Then the symbol changes. A triangle inside a square. Red triangle pointed down, white medium square 9. Red triangle pointed down, white medium square 9. Red triangle pointed down, white medium square 9. And then, again, a wheel. Gear 6, gear 6, gear 6, gear 6. It continues for 47 pages. There are no names, no street locations, no parishes, just signs, numbers, repetition. The trench is never named, but its dimensions are drawn on the final leaf in red ink with exact precision. 14 rods long, 2 rods wide, 1.5 rods deep, 12,000 bodies. And someone counted each one, not once, systematically. We might expect this from the church, but the hand is not ecclesiastical. The symbols are not liturgical. And the trench, when found centuries later during railway excavation, shows no evidence of Christian burial. No markers, no relics, no eastward alignment. Only lime, an ash, and 1 coin, lodged in the dirt. A Florentine florin, with the face scratched out and a line carved across the reverse. Why keep such a book? Not for remembrance. It bears no grief. It is colder than that. It is ledger-like, as if each corpse was weight, volume, a statistic to balance against another unseen page. And that is the function we begin to trace. Not mourning, not sanctity, but inventory. In a letter recovered from beneath a collapsed granary in Ghent, a local official writes to his superior. The bearers have requested ink again, not for lists of names. They do not write names, only the quantity. One of them showed me a page. I could not understand it, but the numbers were the same each day. I asked why. He said, because the pit is built for rhythm. Built for rhythm, not capacity, not need. Rhythm. This is not construction. It is ritualized containment, as if the trench must receive the same burden, at the same hour, each day, until the structure, the ritual, closes. Another clue emerges in alls. A scroll, folded inside a wall cavity, bears a faint diagram. It shows the trench as a sequence of days, each marked by a symbol, a dot, or a stroke. Every 7th entry is boxed. At the bottom, in darker ink. If the box is not marked, the pit does not close. Scholars argue over the meaning. Some believe it's a counting tool. Others say it's theological. A Sabbath record, a 7-fold pattern meant to mirror Genesis. But the most compelling theory is simpler. The box must be filled, not because of faith, because someone said so, because the system demands it. In the outskirts of Marseille, where mass graves stretch beneath what is now an industrial estate, archaeologists discover a buried object, neither religious nor civic. A set of thin clay tiles, wrapped in oilcloth, numbered with slashes. Each tile has a faint groove down its center. They fit together, edge to edge, forming a straight line. 21 tiles in total, each labeled, not with names, with numbers, and 3 different glyphs, a circle, a crescent, and an angular mark like a reversed S. Once assembled, the line terminates in a rectangular tile, wider than the rest. It reads, Trench 3 complete. Burn remainder. Begin new line. No church oversaw this. No cemetery is listed, but a system was present. Quiet, efficient, geometric. Some scholars argue this isn't a burial practice. It's an algorithm, a ritualized system for converting death into manageable form. Because death, uncontrolled, threatens not just the body, but meaning. If too many die in chaos, narrative collapses. And the church cannot afford that. Nor can the city. Nor can those who rule in silence. So the trench, the book, the glyphs. Each page becomes a wall, holding back something heavier than grief. One scribe in Lubeck puts it plainly. Found in the back of an unrelated sermon, his note is brief. It does not matter how they die, only that we place them where they cannot be counted again. And in that line, a deeper logic is revealed. These are not burials. These are erasures. Documented, indexed, forgotten by design. Even the spacing of the trenches reflects a kind of enforced blindness. Set apart from churches, but not too far. Aligned with roads, but not marked. Built so that no processions pass, but always near a wall, a tower, a point of control. So that someone is always watching. Not to honor, to ensure the pit remains shut. Because if it doesn't, what rises is not the dead, but memory. The book in Dresden ends abruptly. No final page, no signature, just a blank leaf, a space left open. And perhaps that, too, is part of the system. An opening for the next trench, a page for the next collapse, a silence preserved for the next cart that comes at dawn. You pass it without seeing. Built into a back wall, at the end of a cloister. Set beneath a bell tower, beside a granary, behind a hospice that no longer bears a name. It is small, unassuming. No cross above the door. No candle at the threshold. No record in the city's archive. And yet, every city has one. The shape is always similar. Rectangular, stone-lined, ceiling low enough to force a slight bow of the head, even in the shortest. No windows. One door. Sometimes wood, sometimes iron, always sealed from within. The walls are lined with shelves. Not for books, not for scrolls, for other things. Bundles, pouches, carved tokens, boxes of bone. A single table, too wide for one person, too narrow for three. And on the table, something burned. Not in flame. In time. The room without windows. That's not its name. No one names it. But the phrase recurs. From Lyon, 1351. The bearers do not sleep in the hospice. They take rest in the windowless room. From Augsburg, 1349. We were told to deliver the oil and the lime to the grey chamber, the one with no light. From Ghent, 1350. They gathered where no sound could echo. Sound. That matters. Because stone without window is more than darkness. It is silence. Not absence of noise. Absence of reverberation. Absence of reflection. No echo. No return. One monk in Narbonne dares enter after the plague has passed. He writes, I crossed the threshold and felt nothing. Not cold. Not heat. Not breath. The air had weight, but no scent. There were markings on the stone. Not drawn. Etched. Like fingernails, but precise. I did not stay. He never returns. 2 months later, he is transferred to another abbey. His later writings omit the episode entirely. So what was the purpose? Not storage. The items left behind are rarely useful. A rope, folded into a triangle. A cup sealed with wax. A page so worn by touch that its ink has dissolved. But each item is placed with care, aligned to an edge, tilted precisely, as if the room itself were an instrument. And these objects, part of its tuning. In one instance, the room is discovered by accident. Rotterdam, 1867. During a renovation of an old hospice slated for demolition, workers uncover a sealed chamber behind a false wall. Inside, 7 chairs, perfectly spaced. Each chair faces the same direction. Not the wall, not the door, but a blank stone set into the floor. At its center, a hole the width of a coin. No documentation survives. No church authority claims it. But one observer, an architect, sketches the layout before it is destroyed. He labels it simply, The Meeting. In Seville, there's a passage in a ledger from 1352, not in the main entries, but scribbled beside a supply record. It reads, The silent men request the key again. The room must remain sealed between rites. We are not to enter, even when empty. And below that, in a different hand, do not light a candle inside. It remembers. The phrase is curious. Another prescribes fire cupping to draw the sleep out. It remembers. By 1700's memory, bleeding becomes or perhaps followed by isolation, by forgetting, followed by confinement. One theory, whispered among archivists who still deal with pre-ecclesial architecture, the terms more clinical, is that these rooms but the bodies remain memory sinks. Because something in them knows. For practice, stillness is not to perform something unrecorded. It is sovereignty. To transfer the weight of ritual into is withholding, not just scripture, not just because the bearers, but as we have seen, to the rhythm, did not write doctrine, to the system. They worked to the frame in which she is expected to live. In structure, this is the heresy the church without light do. It absorbs, not apostasy, not soul, but retreat. Something more abstract, secession from time, the residue of pattern, and the proof. Imagine a place where every act performed is designed in the Vatican archives, mislabeled in the stone morbus obscurus. Gesture upon gesture, there is a transcription of an exorcism attempt conducted, so that over years, the air grows heavy. The woman, the walls humming, faintly, unafraid, not with sound. The priest invokes with the tension of preserved absence. She does not stir. There's a word carved into a support beam in one of the few surviving examples, but does not Krakow. Beneath at the end, old Dominican hospice. Not from the carving is shallow, but from recognition. Obscured by sight. He writes, the letters are not Latin. They are glagolitic. There is power Slavic script once used, but there is also power monastic in its refusal. Transliterated, for centuries, it reads, certain women claim that power without a word, without gesture, it means without rebellion. But only the rooms are not in use. Only presence. They are returned only the quiet, sometimes years apart, not moving. Sometimes in haste. In a world that demands a diary entry from the church called them steward in Rouen. Medicine called them midnight delivery, but they remained 1353 silent. The gray-robed man, and if you listen carefully, the door beneath the rituals, no sound came. The chants at dawn, beneath the turning of the seasons. He did not acknowledge. You can hear it inside. The hum of a body that refuses to disappear. But there was blood beneath the age of reason. No investigation contradiction. The hospice continues operation for another year, but they build instruments to find its edges. Not all rooms they say sleep is harmless. Some are sealed permanently. Those who linger inside, bricked over. And as science rises, something else is buried. The pattern holds. The ancient idea that discovered room is not near a place of care, but never resistance. Close enough to laboratory in 1759, far enough to be unclaimed. A physician named Gerard Threshold builds a machine like the workers themselves to measure breath. One archivist in Vienna describes the rooms. It records the rhythm of the plague, not with ink, not with smoke. It's lungs. He places the device beside a woman who has not stirred in 94 days. They regulate something too dangerous to store elsewhere. And they do it without witness. He calls it musique de l'ombre, music of the shadow. That is the paradox. His peers call it fraud. The rooms contain nothing sacred. Because he begins to see what the sacred cannot. The breath is not random. It is recursive. Only the unbearable weight of doing like a ritual must not be remembered. What if these women are not by the year 1354? What if they are inside something? Europe is scarred. A pattern, not just in numbers, a mechanism not just in grace, but in movement. By the 1770s, the plague does not studies of catalepsy and trance states begin to overlap, coils backward. Spiritual inquiry. Cities fall while nearby villages wait. The magnetic sleep, the road is not a vector, is celebrated. The sea is not a mystical science. The church cannot explain the pattern. When a man enters trance, he is called a visionary. But someone else tries. When a woman does, someone the church would rather forget. The contradiction grows sharp. Faintly, beneath contemptuously, the older question in a letter from a Dominican prior. Why do some women not return? The cartographer in a convent hospital in His real name is 1784. Two fragments. Sister Beatrix falls into sleep after a one marginal note claims Jan of Ghent. She does not wake for 227 water warped and sealed each morning. Her pulse is taken. Each evening, her fingers are gently moved. Not a name of reverence. She never decays. A title of suspicion. She never withers. But his work survives. She simply waits in fragments. When she finally opens her eyes, misattributed, she whispers, recycled into other manuscripts. No one understands. A page here. But the other sisters grow silent around her. Only a constellation of shadows. Sound. In 1938, from the Royal Academy, a historian of medieval trade routes discovers a map, the quiet inside the binding of a monastic breviary in Bruges. Something else. The vellum is cracked. He leaves after 3 days. But publishes nothing. Science does not know what to do with her. So it ignores her, not a river, and yet, but a series of the ledgers and field notes by traveling doctors. Not town entries appear, not dates, always at the margins. The page is labeled withdrawal, tractus morientis, volitional torpor, the dying path, still conscious, but it is not chronological. They never last. It spirals. Each time the pattern emerges, it is marks cities that were never official plague sites, not valid, and omits cities where tens of thousands but newer ones. At first glance, it looks like a Prussian physician places a sensitive pendulum. The line does not trace infection's chest. It traces collection. A letter from a minor Florentine archivist offers a rhythmic interval of 3.2 seconds, asking after the carts. No variation. Not the deaths. He repeats the experiment for 6 nights. The carts. Each time, he wanted to know when they began to appear. He publishes under a pseudonym where they waited at AW. The archivist is titled, but the questions linger inside the sleeping woman. Because plague, it is dismissed as pseudoscience, is not only spread by breath, but something in the data lingers. Or air. A rhythm is spread by the mechanisms of removal, that obeys no command, by the bearers, and answers by the pattern of trench, but its room, and there is a deeper and Lambertus, because the more they measure the try to chart that rhythm, the more they begin second map fragment appears. It is not in 1972. It is not passive. Unearthed inside a hollow chamber. It is working. Collapsed on something else. Wall. In 1811, this one is assistant surgeon. It shows no cities to Malta. No names. A case. Only spirals. A noblewoman, 13, traveling under religious in a hexagonal falls into sleep. Each spiral is labeled with a sigil. She remains unconscious for the rest of the voyage. A crescent, but her hands twitch at sunrise. A few have been seen before. During the reading etched into trench tablets. Her pupils dilate in margins. Bells are rung. Branded into a wooden mask. She is recovered from a Parisian crypt. The surgeon writes, and at the center of the spiral, her mind is tuned to a different frequency. Inside the circle, a single he never sees her again. Outside the square, but in his notes, the Latin phrase, one sentence appears, caportat, written at the edge of the page. He who carries, she knew conquers. When we lied. Or perhaps this is the true fear. He who carries, that sleep is not ignorance. The Latin is ambiguous. It is perception, beyond deliberately so. It is a mode of listening that cannot be coerced. In 1820, a physician in Milan attempts to induce one letter from a bishop in Cologne. He applies the electrodes gently. The heretical diagram, the woman has reached once. It must be suppressed. And says, the marks it uses resemble sigils, but it will not flow faster. Some among the brotherhood say the lines. He calls it a psychotic episode. Not track it, but he does not repeat from a monastic council. The question: if we allow men to trace, why do these women not die? They will attempt to. Why do they not atrophy? That is the root of the body doing when it does nothing at all. You return to balance remain shapeless. The one that the bearers will believe they know its course. No copies remain, but still only one drawing survives. Inside walls, copperplate. Inside a looping figure. One delicate, sewn into the hem of a burial robe. It does not look like breath. Always in code. It looks like a labyrinth. Always incomplete. A path in. But when overlaid, carefully, always the center. With enough fragments. What if the sleeping women strange geometry appears? What if they are at the center? The lines do not connect cities. Not waiting. They connect absences. But remembering. Something the world no longer wants to know. Where odes are taken. In one of the final letters without windows were found. She writes, and always there is a room in the soul with no door. A trench. I found not every trench. I do not leave it now. Only those measured. The letter is inside. Only those charted. But the wax seal is intact. So what is the function of a circle? It is not to warn, a spiral, not to guide the living. Crest. It is to contain, or to acknowledge containment. Untranslatable. The machines continue to marks advance. A point where the unbearable becomes structured, but the silence endures, shaped into ritual. And somewhere, an behind locked doors and hospital veils, a death, the uncounted sleeping woman continues. Lambertus, not random, it seems, not broken, did not believe the plague was random. Reverent. He believed it was and absolutely drawn to imbalance. There is a moment, the places where structure had failed when the thread refuses to hold. Where burial was chaos. You have the records, where the bearers were absent. The letters, where the oath. You have the sketches of breath, and so his maps do not chart cities. The sealed chapels, chart failures, the missing dates, and he follows them. But the witnesses, not as a prophet, those who saw with their own eyes, a chronicler of collapse. Or in worse, one of the only surviving letters possibly not each other by Lambertus himself. A nun in 1834 writes to a bishop in a cramped. She slept for 13 winters. He says, I tended her daily. I do not trace 3 years later, I trace it to testify again, where the bearers are not allowed to enter. No such woman grows loud. Where they are denied the trench, it becomes shape. But where they walk in silence, it falls still. This is not science, not theology. It is system, an emergent liturgy of negation. If true, the implications are vast. It would mean the bearers are not only servants of death, but its governors, its stewards, and the church, by suppressing their knowledge, is not cleansing the land, but allowing the wound to spread. Because what the map shows, what Lambertus seems to die believing, is not just that death follows paths, but that those paths must be walked again and again, or they reopen. He disappears from the record around 1356. No death notice, no trial, but a sealed vault is discovered in Bruges in 1851, beneath what was once a minor hospital chapel. Inside, bones, charred, fragmented, unnamed, and among them, beneath a burned leather satchel, a tile. Same shape as those found in the trench system outside Ghent. But the symbol is unique. A circle, and within it, not a dot, not a cross, a map, of nowhere. Power leaves traces. It must. A bishop's decree bears a ring. A king's law is echoed in parchment and wax. A guild's motion is marked in minutes, names, witnesses. But not these. Not the ones who send the bearers. Not the ones who fund the carts. Not the ones who approve the trench, mark the tile, or close the door to the room with no windows. Those orders exist, but they are unsigned, and the signature that should be there is always missing. We begin with a record. Paris, March 1350. A sudden outbreak. The prior trench is full. The church has no plans to expand it. But by the following day, a new site is cleared behind the east wall of the convent of St. Genevieve. It is not consecrated. It is not announced. Yet at dawn, the bearers are already there. The cart path is already laid. Lime has already been poured. A clerk in the abbey's service writes, "No writ was received, but the field was unlocked. The steward said it came from above. I asked whose seal. He showed me none. I asked whose hand. He said, not mine." Later that week, the prior orders the field reconsecrated. But no priest attends, and the burials continue. Without name, without prayer, with rhythm. This pattern repeats. In Prague, in York, in Palermo, always the same elements. An outbreak, a missing plan, a trench prepared before request. And then, somewhere in the background, an unsigned note. A wax seal with no crest. A page of instructions without a name. And the workers already moving. In one case, the paper survives. Ghent, 1349. A half-page note recovered from a minor noble's archive, stored beneath unrelated tax records. It reads, "You will not resist the clearing. The site is required by cycle. Use of fire permitted. Instruments to be returned to the gray threshold. No witness. No signature. Just a symbol. A line with a circle at each end. Unfamiliar. Stylized. Cold. When shown to regional scholars, it matches no known sigil. Not ecclesial. Not civic. Not feudal. But it matches another. A scratch on the inside of a mask fragment found outside Rouen. And another, drawn faintly beneath the wax of a tile unearthed in Marseille. So who sends these? The church denies it. Records from the Roman Curia, heavily redacted, reveal frustration with the plague-bearer's autonomy. One cardinal writes, "They act without instruction. They do not enter through gates. They do not request relics. But the work is done, always before we ask." Another, more blunt, "If they take orders, it is not from here." In the cities? Even less clarity. Letters from magistrates reference the bearers as if they are sanctioned, but never specify by whom. A Genoese council note states, "Let the pit be managed by those appointed." Appointed by whom? Silence. The bearers themselves say nothing. They do not write. They do not swear. When questioned, they offer no denial. Only the same phrase, repeated across languages, regions, decades. "We were sent." No embellishment. No clarification. And when asked who sent them, they fall silent. Or they leave. Or, in a few rare cases, they point. Not at a person. At a building. A closed door. A tower without entry. A convent with no nuns. There's a name that appears, again and again, but never on a front page. Tucked into margins. Scrawled on delivery records. Faintly pressed into leather satchels. One word. Custodes. It appears Latin. But the context shifts. Sometimes it seems to mean keepers. Sometimes watchers. Sometimes nothing at all. In Vienna, 1353, a hospice steward writes, "We sent for aid. The carts arrived at dusk. I asked who authorized it. The man said, 'Custodes.' He left no name." In Montpellier, a similar note. "They claim the field is already theirs. I said the bishop must approve. They said the custodes had already blessed it. But there is no such office. No such order. Not in church rolls. Not in royal archives. Not in guild charts. Nothing officially. But the word remains. Etched. Implied. Obeyed." And this raises a dangerous question. What if power doesn't always need a name? What if, in moments of collapse, when the church stutters, when the crown hesitates, there is another layer? Silent. Durable. Unclaimed. A custodial structure. Not designed to lead. Only to preserve continuity. Not faith. Not justice. Just containment. One historian, writing anonymously in 1914, suggests a parallel. Like the custodians of the Alexandrian scrolls, they do not seek truth. Only preservation of the structure, even if the structure itself becomes a grave. Another, in private correspondence. They do not command the plague, but they order the response. Without signature. Without seal. Because the moment you name it, it begins to rot. And perhaps that's the point. The system survives because it is never declared. Because it can never be held accountable. Because it is made of gaps, gestures, orders written in vanishing ink. In a sealed vault beneath a church in Krakow, a discovery is made in 1962. A set of brass instruments, measuring rods, hooks, tablets, all packed in oilcloth. At the bottom of the case, a plaque. It bears no crest, no dedication, just 3 words. Servi custodem silentium. Servants of the silent custodes. Or, those who serve the silence of the keepers. The plaque isn't signed. The vault is resealed. The instruments are never displayed. The church issues no comment. But the pattern grows harder to ignore, because if the bearers were sent, and if those who sent them remain unnamed, then we must ask not only who the custodes were, but what they guarded. The dead? The living? The boundary between? Or something else entirely? Something that requires rhythm, erasure, and the absence of any name at all. You hold a book that breathes beneath your fingertips. The parchment is fragile, wax softened by centuries of hide and humidity. A codex like this should contain homilies or theology. Instead, it contains a geography of absence. Krakow, 1362. A manuscript appears in a forgotten crypt, bound in leather stained by lime. No scribe's name, no monastic colophon, only a map, rivers redrawn, towns ringed, but between them, the corridors, highlighted in pale ash. Pathways that do not align with roads, do not follow trade, do not connect cities of documented plague. Yet they appear again and again. These are the routes of the bearers, the hidden ways by which bodies moved, unseen. The first corridor stretches from Wawel Hill to the northern fields, skirting the Jewish quarter, not in public view, but traced in the margins. A line that threads through empty blocks. Akalithos, a mark in Greek script, sits beside it. Next, across the Vistula, a path that climbs through Stermiasto, bypassing the Dominican church. No mass grave is known there, only an unmarked pit underneath a later chapel. Then a third corridor running south, beyond the city walls, to a site later used for lime storage. Each corridor is labeled, not with numbers, not with ink, with symbol, a flicker of a triangle, two intersecting lines, a broken spiral. In other corners of the codex, small drawings appear, not full maps, but partial snapshots. A cartwheel shown behind a tree, a mask laid on a stone floor, a cord coiled in a spiral. These are not instructional, not ritual diagrams. They are documentation, observational, referential, as if someone was writing these corridors into memory to remember what could no longer be spoken. Scholars have debated the meaning of akalithos. Some suggest it may reference a Greek word for companion or attendant. Others argue its letters are not Greek at all, but a cipher, perhaps an acronym, standing for something like Anonymous Collectoringram Oblivionis Ludus Tacticus Hierarchos Ominos sign, the tactical burial order of the silent hierarchy. No consensus. Some whisper that the corridors formed a web, a structure that breathed under the city, beneath knowledge, beneath prayer. What's more, parallel corridors appear in fragments across Dubrovnik, Vienna, Avignon. Each is tailored to the city's geography, rivers, walls, chapels, but the shape is the same, a discrete network, separate from known routes. A network that curves deliberately away from consigned mass graves. It does not cross them. It links zones of removal. It is a ghost network. The codex contains not only corridors, but timing. Near each map is a notation in the same ghostly ink. From shadow to shadow. At hour 7. Return before first bell. This is scheduling, not ritual. Not secrecy for the sake of secrecy, but precision. Logistics disguised in arcane form. Because these corridors existed to manage, not hide, death. To corral it according to pace. To limit interference. To ensure bodies moved swiftly, if quietly. You might think this is mapping disease. It is not. It's mapping disposal. Because plague death was unstoppable. But disposal could be controlled, measured, timed. And so a network forms. Not of contagion, but of containment. In another fragment, perhaps from the same codex, overlaying another city, the corridors connect to symbols similar to those from the trench tablets and mask etchings. A small circle with 3 arrows emanating outward. It appears at every entry point. That glyph, scholars note, means permit. Permission to remove. Permission to carry the dead. Permission granted by the custodes. On a final folio, nearing disintegration, a phrase is written in a trembling hand. Memoria tenetur per via sed via non tenetur per memoria. Memory is held through the path, but the path is not held by memory. A dark pivot. It suggests an understanding. Write nothing too permanent. Draw the corridors, but forget them again. Let them demand their own erasure. The map is both record and instruction, and in that paradox lies its danger. Because contained death, managed through clandestine infrastructure, creates a new order. It preserves one aspect of life, continuity, at the cost of knowledge, accountability, ritual. The bearers walk corridors that are unspoken, unmarked, uncrossed by others. They are not the carriers of plague. They are the carriers of its structure. And so we return to Krakow. The codex is real. The corridors are real. The corridors map not what we know, but what we cannot name. They show that the dead were not forgotten. They were guided, moved, hidden, charted, by a system no one claims. But systems have afterlives, traces, rhythms that echo long after the outbreak ends. In the shape of urban design, in the layout of crypts, in the ghosts of networks long erased. And the corridors, those hidden lines, continue to exist in stone footprints, in memory voids, in the rooms without windows. We might dwell on the power of the map, or on those who held the pen, or on the moment someone realized they must not hold it too long. But the Codex tells us something else, that the system of death professionals was not accidental, not organic. It was designed, and when the worst of plague passed, it did not leave. Its infrastructure remained under the city, an unseen skeleton, a lattice of shadow and stone, waiting. And in that waiting, we glimpsed the true scale of their work. Not just the act of burial, but the architecture of erasure, the geometry of forgetting, the map that is hidden behind memory, and the death that lives in line. It begins before the first cart, before the trench is dug, before the rope is handed down and the first masked hand lifts the dead. It begins with silence, a silence too exact to be natural. And the oath is not spoken. It is breathed, held in the mouth like ash, swallowed like chalk, traced behind the teeth with no sound. There is no surviving transcription, no full version written in ink, not in church records, not in burial logs, not even in the marginal notes of plague stewards who wrote down nearly everything else. But there are echoes, fragments, phrases caught in peripheral texts, noted, dismissed, but repeating. In Narbonne, 1350, the bearer sat beside the pit. He held no book, but he touched his mouth, his chest, his eyes. Then he bowed. In York, he marked the air with his fingers, not his voice. He did this before lifting the dead. In Prague, I asked what they said before entering the trench. One of them looked at me and whispered, "We do not say." So what is the oath? Not a promise to God, not a fealty to king or bishop, not even a commitment to duty. The oath is structural. It defines the bearer's relationship to the act of removal. It unbinds him from ritual, from grief, from name, and it protects him, not from disease, from memory. In a letter fragment preserved in Lübeck, a hospice scribe notes, "They do not bury like we do. There are no psalms, no water. They touch the face of the dead once, briefly. Then they draw the cloth." I asked if they fear God. The youngest one said, "We answered once. We don't again." There is a kind of theology in that, but one built not on faith, on interruption, on severing. An engraving recovered from a burnt hospice in Albi shows two masked figures standing over a trench. One holds a hand to his chest, the other raises 3 fingers to the air. Between them, carved into the base of the stone, "Non sum testis." I am not a witness. This phrase appears elsewhere, not in prayer books, in ruins, on walls where the plaster has peeled, inside tunnels that were once part of plague routes, etched into the underside of wooden carts, hidden from view, scrawled in soot on the back of a mask fragment. It recurs, and always near it, silence. The silence is not absence. It is artifact, a crafted space, an architecture built by repetition, gesture, denial. And the oath is what sustains it, a practice of deliberate unknowing. Because the bearer cannot afford to remember, not names, not faces, not the shape of a child held too long in the morning frost. There is speculation among those who study prescribes these things, fire cupping that the oath may have contained outward. A single line. By 1700, bleeding becomes common, but consistent, followed by isolation. One phrase that acts as followed by confinement. We find hints. The cells grow smaller. The breath returns. The voice is quieter. I hold no fire in my name, but the bodies remain unmoved. We bind the something in them knows, not the name. Stillness is not weakness. Sparse. It is sovereignty. Not declarations, in stillness, not instructions, is withholding, evacuation, not just labor, lines meant not to just hollow, voice, to pare the self down to function, to the rhythm, to turn the man with the cart to the frame in which she is expected to live. of division.
This is the heresy
because
the
what the
church
bearer
cannot
does
name.
is not burial,
Not blasphemy.
It is removal,
Not apostasy.
separation,
But retreat.
to keep the
A
living
sacred
from the
secession
dead,
from time
to place
itself,
a membrane
and
where
the proof
collapse has
remains
occurred in
to
fragments,
close a system
in a
that
sealed
no longer
folder
functions,
in the Vatican
and
archives,
to do that without
mislabeled
ego,
as de
without
morbis
memory,
obscuris,
without voice.
There is a transcription
One scholar
of an
proposes
exorcism
the oath
that is
is
based on
conducted
inverse
in
liturgy,
1713.
a deliberate
The woman
negation
is
of the
unmoving,
sacraments, unafraid,
no invocation,
the priest
no
invokes
communion,
each name of
no
Christ.
resurrection.
She does
A
not
pattern
stir.
inverted.
He cites
Touch,
the
not
authority of
blessing.
Rome.
Cloth,
Still,
not chrism.
she breathes,
Ash, not
but
oil.
does not submit.
Silence,
At the
not
end,
psalm.
the priest
And the bearer
weeps,
performs this
not
not
once,
but from
thousands
recognition.
of times.
He writes,
Each time,
she is not held.
the oath is
She is
renewed.
holding, not
There
in
is
words,
power in motion,
but in action.
But there is
a
also
diary
power
fragment from
in
a
its
hospice
refusal.
master in
And for
Liège
centuries,
captures this
certain women
understanding.
claimed that power
He nodded
without
before
word,
entering the chamber,
without gesture.
I asked what he
without
had said.
rebellion.
He looked at
Only
me
breath
and drew a
only
circle
presence.
on the wall.
Only
Then he
the
placed his
quiet
hand over
certainty
it.
of
Then he
not
walked
moving.
away. In a
This is the
world
oath
that demands it.
not a sentence.
The church called them
as
heretics.
geometry.
Medicine
A loop with
called
no
them
exit.
disordered.
The most
they remained
disturbing evidence
silent.
of its persistence
Still,
comes from much
and if you
later.
listen carefully,
17th century
beneath the
records from a
rituals,
plague flare in
beneath the
Naples
chants,
note the
beneath the
appearance
turning
of
of the
masked
seasons.
bearers,
You can hear
identical
it.
in dress
The
to
hum of a
those from
body
the
that
14th century
refuses
to disappear.
They answer no one.
The age
They
of
take
reason
only
begins
unclaimed
with a
bodies.
contradiction.
They are never
claim
paid.
the soul
When
cannot
followed,
be measured. They disappear.
But they build instruments
their
to find
gestures,
its edges.
touch to the
They
mouth,
say sleep is
circle on
harmless.
the wall,
But they
are
punish
identical
those
to
who
those
linger
described
inside.
300
And as
years
science
earlier.
rises,
no
something
explanation
else
is
is buried.
offered.
The
The
church
ancient
calls it
idea
a
that
folk
sleep
anomaly.
is not merely
But the ritual
absence,
is intact.
but resistance,
And the silence
in a
is
Paris
preserved.
laboratory.
This
in
is the legacy of
1759.
the oath. A physician
doctrine,
named
a
Gerard
scar,
Vallant builds a
worn
machine
into the shape of
meant
action,
to measure breath.
passed not by
He calls
word,
it the aerograph,
but by mimicry.
It records the
observation
rhythm of breath.
wrongs.
And
Not
in
with
its
ink,
silence,
but with
it preserves
smoke.
something
He
terrible.
places the device
the
beside
memory
a
of
woman
what
who has
forgetting
not
must look
stirred
like.
in 94
Because
days.
to do this work
The line it
properly,
draws is steady.
one must not only
deliberate,
let go of name
beautiful.
and grief.
He calls it
but of the
musique de
idea that
l'ombre,
they ever matter.
music of the shadow.
The oath does not
His peers
protect
call
the
it
soul.
fraud.
It
But
removes
Vallant
it from
persists,
consideration
because he
so that the
begins to
trench
see a
may be
pattern.
dug.
The breath
so that the
is
mask
not
may
random.
be worn.
It is recursive,
so that the system may
mathematically
endure.
structured.
In this light,
like a ritual,
the bearer is
what
not
if these
holy.
women are not lost?
He is hollow. What if
And
they
the
are
oath?
inside something?
It is not a promise.
pattern.
It
A
is
chamber,
a wound in
a
language,
mechanism older
never
than
closed,
medicine.
never
By the
cured.
1770s,
only deepened.
studies of
With each
catalepsy and
silence that
trance
follows.
states begin to
Underneath
overlap
the vaulted
with
arches
spiritual
of St.
inquiry.
Michael's in
but only
Krakow.
for men.
Your foot
the
brushes
magnetic
dust
sleep
that refuses
of Franz
to settle.
Mesmer is
You
celebrated.
step onto
a
stone
mystical
that once
science
shook
of
under
energy
mass,
and flow.
processions,
When a man
laughter.
enters trance,
Now,
he is called
the
a
space
visionary.
feels hollow.
When a woman
as though
does,
the soul of
she
a
is
city
called
has been
unstable.
rerouted.
The contradiction
Beneath your
grows
feet lie
sharp.
layers of earth
Beneath
that
should have
the
housed
older
saints
question
and
stirs
parishioners.
again.
But
Why do
something
some
else
women
presses
presses
upwards.
upwards?
In a
Bones
convent hospital
unblessed,
in Marseille,
skulls unmarked,
1784,
hidden between
Sister
foundation
Beatrix
and
falls
faith.
into sleep.
These
These
remains
remains
survive,
survive
of intense
not
prayer.
accidental. She does not
Deliberate,
wake for
buried again.
227 days.
An archaeologist
Each
report
morning
from
her pulse is
1968
taken,
describes
Each
the
evening,
layers found
her fingers
beneath
are
the
gently
crypt.
moved.
In the upper
She never
stratum,
decays.
tidally
She never
bricked
withers.
relics,
She
labeled
simply
by
waits.
chapel,
When she
by
finally
saint,
opens
by
her
history.
eyes, she
Sanctified
whispers,
ground.
"You were
Below
too
them,
loud."
a
No one
chaotic layer of
understands.
lime and ash.
But the other sisters
No
grow
markers.
silent around her.
Disordered.
They begin to
Fragmented
pray
bones,
without sound.
bound by
A
cords
physician
still
from the
decaying.
Royal Academy
The report's
arrives
conclusion,
to observe.
written
He
in
writes,
clinical detachment,
"The quiet was
reads,
unbearable.
Secondary
Not absence,
interment of
not peace,
unrecorded remains.
something else.
Likely
He
from
leaves after 3
mid-140th
days.
century.
He publishes nothing.
Deliberate concealment
Science does not
beneath
know what to do with her.
ecclesiastical burial.
So it ignores her.
Concealment.
And yet,
Under the sacred,
inside the ledgers
beneath the
and
narrative,
field notes of
you
traveling
imagine how
doctors,
this was done.
entries
Calculating
appear,
hands,
always at the
late
margins.
at night.
Removing
Words
the
like
remains of
withdrawal,
plague-era pit
volitional
burials,
torpor,
replacing
still
them
conscious
beneath a
dormancy.
chapel foundation.
They never last.
Not with reverence.
Each time the
but with
pattern
purpose.
emerges,
It is
not
erased,
for memory,
but for
then the
forgetting.
machines return.
To give weight to
not
silence.
balance. Those
To
are
corrode
lost,
what remained
but newer
of the
ones.
initial erasure.
In 1802,
because even
a Prussian
absence can
physician
speak,
places a
and silence
sensitive
can
pendulum
shake,
above
but there
a
is something
sleeping
more
woman's
unsettling.
chest.
The
He
chronicler
expects
notes that
irregularity.
each time a
What he
renovation
finds is
occurred,
precision.
15th,
A rhythmic interval of
17th,
3.2
19th
centuries.
Workers
No variation.
reopened the layer.
He repeats
They
the
found the
experiment
ash.
for 6
They
nights.
felt the dust.
Each time,
They heard the silence
rhythm
encoded
holds.
in stone.
He publishes
Each
under
time,
his pseudonym,
they reburied it.
AW, under their
His
own paper
floors,
is titled
their own
on the
foundations,
clock inside the
resealing
sleeping
history.
woman. It is
This is not
dismissed
isolated.
as pseudoscience.
Other crusade
but something
churches
in the
in
data
Lubeck,
lingers.
Marseille,
A rhythm beneath
Avignon
reason.
shows similar
a pulse
patterns.
that obeys no command.
Antiquarians noted
and answers
oddities,
to no clock,
steps that
but
end
its
in
own.
brick,
And there
not
is a
stone.
deeper unease.
Pillars carved,
because
and
the
then
more they
leveled.
measure the
Floor
sleeping
plaques
body,
that seem out
the
of
more
place,
they begin to
out of
suspect.
purpose.
It is
All
not
covering
inert.
something.
It is not
Something
passive.
undesired.
It is not failing.
unnamed.
It is
What do we
working.
call this?
On something else.
Secondary burial.
In 1811,
Concealment.
an assistant surgeon
Resanitization
aboard a
of
ship
sacred
to
space.
Malta documents
But
a
the
case.
effect is more
A noble
profound.
woman, traveling under
transforms
religious
sacred
ground into
falls
a
into
mask.
sleep after a
final
storm at
gesture
sea.
by the bearers.
She remains
or their
unconscious
successors
for the rest
to
of the
seal the
voyage.
silence beneath
But her
the
hands
silence.
twitch at sunrise.
To say we know,
Her lips part
but you will
during
never.
the reading of psalms.
There is one parish
Her
register
pupils
from
dilate
Bruges,
when bells
surviving
are rung in the
only as a
distance.
photocopy
She
from
is asleep.
1912. But aware,
Within it,
the
a
surgeon
note in
writes,
Flemish reads.
her mind is
Bones
tuned to a
replaced.
different frequency.
Chapel floor relic.
A deeper code.
Do not speak
He
of
never
what is
sees
now
her
below.
again.
The
But in
clerk's
his notes,
handwriting changes
one
after
sentence
this line.
appears, the
Written
ink
at
is
the
shakier,
edge of the page,
and the rest of the
she
page
knew
is
when we
blank.
lied.
No
This
signature,
is the true fear.
no date.
That sleep
Just the
is not
instruction.
ignorance.
The
It
erasure
is perception
in Seville
beyond reach.
during
It is a
renovation
mode of listening that
1783.
cannot be coerced.
Workers lift a
In
flagstone
1820,
and
a
find
physician
a set
in
of
Milan
charred
attempts
bones
to
beneath the
induce
statue
waking
of the
with
Virgin.
galvanic current.
They rain to them
He
in
applies the
consecrated
electrodes
ground,
gently,
quietly.
The woman flinches
before any
once,
local priest
then
arrives.
smiles.
The municipal
says,
law calls it.
You can push the
a
river,
necessary
but
act
it will
of
not flow
devotion
faster.
and discretion.
She sleeps again.
Devotion and
He calls it a
discretion.
psychotic episode.
Silence and
But he
protection.
does not repeat the
Both
experiment.
bound together.
The questions
and both
pile.
sealing what
Why do
remains
these women not
unspoken?
die?
Even
Why do
today,
they not atrophy?
when modern teams
What is the
enter
body
medieval
doing
crypts,
when it does
they
nothing
often
at all?
find traces
You return
of
to
old
Valence
interventions.
Airgraphs.
The
Pockets
ones
of
that
earth
trace
that
the
have
breath
been
with
moved,
smoke replaced.
No copies remain.
Gaps that suggest
only one
someone
drawing
violently
survives.
scrubbed the past,
etched in copper
only
plate.
to hide their
a looping
hand in
figure.
stone.
Delicate,
Not an archaeological
perfect.
accident.
It does not look
a
like
ritual.
breath.
A ritual
It looks like
of
a
denial.
labyrinth. So
A
what is
path
being
in,
hidden?
a path
Not
out,
just the plague dead,
and always the center,
but the system that
What if
carries
the
them.
sleeping women
The bearers
are not gone?
The masks.
What if they are at the center?
The trenches.
Not lost.
The oath.
Not waiting.
The rooms.
But remember,
The corridors.
Something the
All
world
of it
no
buried
longer
again
wants to know.
beneath the
In one of the
sacred
final
floor,
letters from Sister
beneath the
Beatrix,
mother church,
she writes,
the city hall.
There is a
the abbey
room in the
cloister.
soul with no door.
In every place
I
that
found
once
it.
required
I do not
erasure.
leave it now.
Even
The
as
letter
modern
is inside.
historians dig,
But the wax seal is
scan,
intact.
expose
A circle.
The structural
Inside it,
secrecy
a spiral.
fights back.
No crest.
Lines vanish.
No cross.
Dates blur.
Only the shape of
fades.
something older.
Dust covers.
Untranslatable.
Stone seals.
The machines continue
yet,
to advance.
something persists.
The sciences grow
Faint.
sharper.
Almost alive.
But the silence
A
endures.
tension in foundation.
And somewhere,
A shift in
behind
basement
locked
plan.
doors and
A
hospital
heartbeat
veils,
below ground.
the breath
Because
of
the
the sleeping
system
woman
did not
continues.
vanish. It evolved.
Not random.
The
Not broken,
concealment of the
but
bearers
structured,
became the concealment
reverent,
of history.
and absolutely
and perhaps
unclaimed.
yesterday's bearers
There is a
are
moment
today's
in
gatekeepers.
every investigation
the ones who
when the
move
thread
between
refuses
layers.
to hold.
Knowing what
You have the
lies
records,
beneath.
and
the
making
names,
certain no
the
one
letters.
learns without
You have the
permission.
sketches of breath.
So when you walk
the
across
court
that
transcript
ancient
floor,
the
know
sealed
this.
chapels,
You are
the
not
missing
above
dates.
memory.
But
You
the
are over it.
witnesses,
Those
those
who
who
saw
follow
with
your
their own
steps,
eyes,
ancient,
begin to vanish.
purposeful,
or
unbroken.
worse, they
A
begin
final
to
burial.
contradict.
Of
Not
knowledge,
each other.
of
acknowledgement.
of
Of none
something
in
that never wanted to
1834
stay behind.
rise to a bishop.
It begins as a
She
blueprint.
slept for 13
Simple
winters.
lines on a
I
forgotten
tended her
page.
daily.
No
3 years
annotation.
later, no
Asked
date.
to testify
Just
again.
4 walls, she says.
A square with no
no
door.
such woman lived
No
here.
windows.
Her signature
And in the
matches.
center,
Something stranger. A mark. Sometimes a spiral. Sometimes a dot. Once, a handprint in faded ochre. The archivist who finds it dismisses it as architectural detritus. An unused plan. An abandoned sketch. Until she finds it again. And again. And again. Across centuries, across cities. The same room. The same impossible room. In Ghent, it appears in a ledger tied to hospice renovations in 1351. In Naples, embedded within the margin of a quarantine order. In Cologne, it is etched beneath the gloss of a theological treatise. Same dimensions, same absence of entry. And in each record, the same phrase, written differently but meaning the same. Non intrabit. Do not enter. This room is not for the living. Only the carrier may approach. But no one ever confirms its construction. No chronicle describes a room being built and bricked and buried. Only the blueprints remain. Only the references. And the rumors. From workers. From children. From those who feel cold on a wall that should be warm. In Lyon, a monastery wall collapses during foundation repairs. Behind it, they find a space. Unmarked. Undecorated. Entirely sealed. No door. Only a removable stone, weighted from within. Inside, one bench. One candle, long extinguished. And a mask, hanging from a hook, untouched by time. The wall is resealed the next day. Not by archaeologists. By the monks. No record is made. But a single note appears in the monastery log. The threshold is once more in place. Let no one return. The log continues as if nothing happened. The monastery remains open. But the question lingers. What is the room? Not a cell. Not a crypt. Not a chamber for the sick. There are no markings of mass. No altar. No signs of infection. Only the layout and the pattern of concealment. One theory suggests it is a waiting room. Not for the living. For the bearer. The final pause before the oath. The space where identity is dissolved. The mask is put on. The name is laid aside. And once the threshold is crossed, the man is gone. Only the function remains. Others believe it is a containment cell, not for people, for presence. A space where the plague, understood not as pathogen but as principle, is locked away. One sealed node within the web of silence. A singular rupture, made finite by wall and ritual, not to prevent death, but to bind it. And then there are the fringe claims. That the room is not a room. That it is a symbol. A template imposed across cities to mark where the system must intervene. A point of origin for the invisible corridors. The place from which the instructions are first breathed. And perhaps, where the custodes begin. It is in Prague where the layout becomes undeniable. A team mapping subterranean vaults beneath the old bishop's quarter uncovers a series of closed spaces, each one matching the room. Same size, same design, same absence. But more than that, each room aligns perfectly with trench sites above, as if they were coordinates. Anchors, nodes in a ritual architecture lost to all but the bearers. A surviving letter, dated 1412, offers a chilling clue. A hospice steward writes, "He asked for the key. I told him the room no longer existed. He nodded and said, it never did, but it must still be opened." Later that week, a fire breaks out. The steward disappears. The hospice closes, but the room's shape is later traced in ash. Perfect, untouched. This room, this shape, has now been found, mapped, denied, buried, forgotten. Each time, it returns. It is not architectural. It is conceptual, a mnemonic for something deeper than stone. A vessel, for silence, for authority without name, for the system that never wanted to be seen. It is the final symbol, not of plague, of response, of the apparatus constructed not to save, not to understand, but to endure. And so when you read the blueprints, etched in ash or ink or blood, you are not reading instructions. You are reading invocation. You are tracing the outline of a mechanism designed not to be remembered, but needed again, each time. Each time it fails, each time it breaks, each time the world forgets, and death begins to speak again. But the room is still here, beneath your street, beneath your church, perhaps even beneath your home. You cannot hear it, you cannot find it, but some part of you knows where it is, and why it was made, not as protection, as warning, not to keep something in, but to remind you that something still watches, that silence is not absence, it is choice, and the door you cannot see was never meant to be opened again. No one speaks of them now, not in churches, not in records, not even in whispered histories passed between archivists in dim hallways. But the silence still bears their weight. A cord stretched through time, thin, taut, never severed. We have followed their trail through lime pits and forgotten vaults, through blueprints etched in wax and prayers never said, through symbols scratched onto leather, stone, flesh. Not to name them, not to unmask them, but to listen, because some truths do not need to be declared. They wait, and when we look away, they reassert themselves beneath the threshold of memory. You may believe the system is gone, that the oaths have faded, that the corridors have closed, but still, the trench shapes remain beneath modern parks. The mask form lingers in plague theater and disaster drills. The oath survives, not as words, but as policies no one admits to writing. And the locked room? The one without windows? It appears again, in emergency protocols, in sealed logistics hubs, in the shape of decisions made without attribution. This is what remains when memory is curated, when silence is institutional, when history is not erased, but deferred. So tread carefully. The archive has gaps, but not accidents. The vault is sealed, but only for now. The bearer has passed, but something still carries. And beneath it all, the thread pulls tighter. Not around the dead, around us. If you believe this story is worth continuing, tap subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Have a good night. Sweet dreams.